Three men walked across her yard before dawn with her dead father's cane in their hands. She was 22 years old. She had been married exactly 18 days, and the three mountain men she had come to call husband and brothers were already in position. One behind the door with a shotgun, one in the loft with a rifle, one at her back with a Winchester. They had all of them been waiting for this. But to understand how a Philadelphia preacher's daughter ended up on a mountain in Montana with three identical brothers in a cane from a grave 2,000 miles away, we have to go back to the snow, to the day the stagecoach left her alone on the trail. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in silence so complete that Elspeth Whitfield could hear her own heartbeat thundering against her ribs. The driver did not speak. He did not help her down. He simply sat hunched beneath his heavy buffalo coat, eyes fixed on the tree line as if he expected something to emerge from the pines at any moment. "Miss," his voice came rough like gravel scraping tin. "This is where I leave you." Elspeth pressed her gloved hands against the worn leather seat and looked out through the small window. There was no town. There was no station. There was no husband waiting with a buggy and a kind smile. There was only a crude wooden signpost leaning against the wind, its letters weathered but still legible. Silver Pines, 3 miles. And beyond that sign, nothing but the great black wall of the Bitterroot Mountains rising into a sky the color of cold iron. She felt the cold reach into the coach and lay its hand on her throat. "Sir," the letter said, "a Mr. Beckett would be meeting me at the station." "This is the station, miss." "But there is no station." The driver turned his head just enough to look at her, and she saw in his eyes something she had not seen in any man since her father had died. It was pity, raw and unvarnished pity, the kind a man gives to a stranger he does not expect to see again. "The Becketts come down from the mountain when they please," he said. "If they do not come, you will want to start walking before dark. There are wolves in these parts, and worse." He reached behind him and dropped her small trunk onto the frozen earth. The sound of it landing was the sound of a door closing on her old life. Before she could speak, before she could protest or beg, the driver slapped the reins and the stagecoach lurched forward, the wheels groaning through the first thin crust of snow, and within a minute it was a dark shape dwindling toward the eastern horizon. Elspeth stood alone on the trail. She was 22 years old. She had 73 cents left in her purse. She had a letter folded against her breast from a man she had never met. And the first snow of a Montana winter was beginning to fall around her shoulders in slow, patient silence. She looked down at the trunk that held everything she still owned in the world. A woolen shawl that had been her mother's, 3 books her father had preached from, a small cameo brooch of carved ivory, a change of undergarments, and the dress she wore, now a navy blue traveling gown, that had cost her the last of her dignity to keep clean through 11 days of rail cars and stagecoach benches. The wind cut through the dress as if it were paper. Before we go further into this story, friend, if you are new here, I invite you to subscribe. I share new stories of the American frontier every week. Stories of men who kept their word when the world gave them every reason not to. Stories of women who walked into the wilderness with nothing but courage and found more than they ever dreamed. If that is your kind of story, you are home. And before we continue, I would love to know, which state are you listening from tonight? Leave a word in the comments. Tell me where you are, and I will read every one. Now back to Elspeth Whitfield standing in the falling snow. She heard them before she saw them. It was a sound she did not recognize at first. A low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from inside the earth itself. She turned toward the tree line, and the sound resolved into what it truly was. Hoofbeats. 3 sets of hoofbeats moving in perfect unison, descending the mountain. Out of the pines they came. 3 men on 3 horses, riding abreast down a narrow trail no one but a native-born mountain man would have recognized as a trail at all. The snow fell harder now, and the 3 riders emerged from it like figures out of some old frontier painting, their wide-brimmed hats pulled low, their long canvas coats buttoned against the cold, their breath and the breath of their horses rising together in a single white cloud. Elspeth tried to move. She found she could not. They rode directly toward her, and she understood as they drew near that she was looking at three brothers. Three men born of the same hour, identical in build, identical in bearing, identical in the hard-weathered beauty of their faces. Each of them tall as a doorframe, each of them broad as a threshing sledge, each of them with a dark beard and hair that brushed the collar of his coat, and each of them with eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. They stopped their horses 10 paces from her, and they did not speak. For the longest moment of her life, Elspeth Whitfield and the three Beckett brothers regarded each other across the falling snow. She studied them because she could not help studying them. They were the same, yes, but already she began to see the differences. The one in the center sat his horse with a stillness that spoke of command. His jaw was set, his mouth was hard, and one hand rested near the Winchester rifle in its scabbard against his thigh. This was a man accustomed to making decisions other men followed. She knew it the way a person knows the smell of rain coming. The one on the left was the same man, and yet not the same man. His shoulders were easier. His hands held the reins with a kind of gentleness she could feel from where she stood. There was a softness around his eyes that the center brother did not possess. If the center was iron, this one was leather, worked and warm. The one on the right was iron too, but a harder kind. His eyes did not stay still. They moved across the tree line, across the snow, across her and past her and back again. He did not look at her the way the others did. He looked at everything around her as if he were waiting for something to come out of the trees. One hand rested on the butt of a heavy pistol at his hip, and it rested there the way a sleeping dog rests against its master. Natural, ready. The center brother spoke first. "Miss Whitfield?" It was not a question. His voice was lower than she had imagined, rougher. It carried the particular hoarseness of a man who did not often use it. She felt the sound of her own name in that voice, and she felt something in her chest unlatch that she had not known was latched. Yes, she could not manage more than that one word. Her lips were numb. "I am Holden Beckett." He swung down from the saddle in a single easy motion, and she was astonished to see that he was taller off the horse than she had guessed on it. He stood a full head and a half above her, and his shoulders blocked out the mountain behind him. "These are my brothers, Ezra." The soft-eyed one nodded, and Silas. The watchful one did not nod. He only looked. "We need to speak to you before we take you up the mountain," Holden said. "There are things the letter did not tell you." Elspeth felt the cold move deeper into her bones. "I do not understand." "You will, but not standing out here in this weather." He unbuckled his heavy canvas coat, and before she could protest, he had laid it across her shoulders. The coat was so large it hung to her ankles. It smelled of pine smoke and leather, and of a man who worked with his hands from sunup until dark. "Ezra, get her trunk." Silas scout the back trail. "I do not like the quiet." Silas turned his horse without a word and rode back into the trees from the direction they had come. Ezra dismounted and lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He glanced at her as he did it, and the glance carried something she could not read. Apology, perhaps, or sorrow, or some third thing she did not yet have a name for. Holden turned back to her. "Miss Whitfield, there is something I have to tell you now before you come any farther with us. And when I tell you, you may want to turn around. If you do, I will see you back to Missoula myself. I will pay your passage back to Philadelphia. I will give you $500 to start again. No one will touch you. No one will speak an unkind word. You have my word as a Beckett, and that is the only word I have to give." Her throat closed. "Tell me." "The advertisement said one man needed a wife. That was the truth, but it was not the whole truth." He drew a slow breath, and she saw for the first time that this man, this mountain of a man, was afraid. Not of her, of losing something. "Ezra and Silas and I, we live in the same house. We have lived in the same house for 21 years. Our mother died when we were 12. Our father died when we were 16. The three of us raised each other on that mountain. We built the cabin together. We worked the land together. We have not been apart for more than a month in 2 decades. She did not speak. She could not. I am the one who will marry you, Holden said. My name will be on the papers. My ring will be on your hand. But Ezra and Silas live in the house. They will not leave. They cannot leave. And I will not ask them to. The wind moved the snow across the trail in long white curtains. You will have the upstairs bedroom. Holden went on, his voice softening now, the way a man softens his voice for a frightened horse. With a lock that works. I sleep in the room off the kitchen. Ezra sleeps in the library. Silas prefers the barn loft, and he has preferred it since he came back from the war. No man will cross the threshold of your bedroom. Not me. Not either of my brothers. Not unless you open that door yourself and do it willing. She felt her hand rise to her throat. Miss Whitfield, Elspeth, if you can hear me, tell me you can hear me. I hear you. This arrangement will be hard. I will not lie to you and say it will be easy. You will cook for 3 men and we eat like 3 men. You will wash clothes and keep a house that sees hard use. The winters are long, the silence is long, and some nights you will wonder why you ever stepped off that stagecoach. But I swear to you on the graves of my mother and father that in this house you will be safe. You will be fed, you will be warm, and you will be respected. From the oldest of us to the youngest, you have my word, and a man of the Beckett name keeps his word. She looked past him at Ezra, who stood holding her trunk, his breath fogging in the cold. Ezra met her eyes and he smiled. It was the smallest smile she had ever seen. It was also the first honest smile she had seen in 9 months. She looked at the tree line. Silas had not come back yet. She looked back at Holden Beckett. And if I say no, then I take you to Missoula tonight. I pay for your room and your board. I pay for your train east. I put $500 in your hand when you board that train, and I never speak of it again. No one in Philadelphia will ever know where you went. My brothers will grieve. They have waited for this, but they will not ask. We will ride back up that mountain, the same 3 men we have always been, and we will wish you well for the rest of our lives. The snow was falling harder. She felt it settle in her hair. She thought of Philadelphia. She thought of the lodging house on Market Street, where the landlord had put his hand on the small of her back and told her she had 3 days. She thought of Cornelius Thackeray, her sister's husband, who had taken the $2,400 her father had left her and vanished into the railroad smoke of Chicago. She thought of her mother's grave green with summer grass and her father's grave still raw and the hunger that had been her companion for 6 weeks. She thought of the 73 cents in her purse. She thought of how no kind man in the whole city of Philadelphia had offered her anything but the back of his hand or the front of his bed. She thought of Holden Beckett's coat on her shoulders, heavy and warm as an answered prayer. I will come with you, she said. Holden closed his eyes for one long second. When he opened them again, she could see that something in him had broken and been remade in a single breath. Thank you. That was all he said, but the way he said it filled the whole clearing. They rode up the mountain as the last of the light bled out of the sky. Elspeth rode behind Ezra on his big roan mare, her arms held carefully at her sides, her cheek almost touching the canvas of his coat, but not quite. Holden rode ahead. Silas had rejoined them from the tree line and now rode at the rear, turning his horse every 100 yards to look back the way they had come. She did not ask what he was watching for. She did not want to know. The trail switched back and forth across the face of the mountain. The pines closed over them. The snow came down through the branches in slow, drifting flakes that caught the last of the light and glowed for a moment before landing. She had never seen a forest like this. In Pennsylvania, the woods were tame. They had fences at the edges. Here the woods had no edges. Here the woods were the world. Ezra spoke once during that ride. Only once. There is a hot fire in the cabin. He said over his shoulder quietly as if he were afraid to startle her. "And coffee, and my brother Holden made stew before we came down. If you will forgive me saying so, miss, you look like you have not been warm in a long time." She was glad he was facing forward. She was glad he could not see her face. She did not trust her face. "I have not been warm in a long time," she said. She felt him nod. They did not speak again until the cabin came into view. It sat in a clearing on a shoulder of the mountain, and the moment she saw it, her mind revised itself entirely. She had imagined a rough shack, a lean-to, a single room with a dirt floor. What she saw instead was a house, a true house. 2 stories of squared pine logs fitted so tightly that not a whisper of wind could pass between them. A roof of split cedar shakes, a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a thick, steady column. Real glass in the windows, not oiled paper, not shuttered holes. Real glass, and behind that glass, the golden flicker of firelight. Beside the house stood a barn larger than the house itself, a smokehouse, a spring house, a workshop with a forge, a woodshed stacked so high with split pine that she could not see where the stack ended. Someone had cared for this place. Someone had spent 20 years making it what it was. Elspeth understood in that moment that she had misjudged these men from the beginning. Holden dismounted at the barn and led the horses inside. Silas followed without a word. Ezra helped her down from the roan mare, and when her boots touched the ground, her knees nearly buckled from exhaustion and cold, and the strange weightlessness of having finally arrived somewhere. Ezra caught her elbow, and the moment he did, he let go again, just as quickly as if her arm had burned him. "The door is unlocked," he said. "Go inside, warm yourself. We will see to the horses." She walked across the snowy yard on legs that did not feel like hers. She put her hand on the iron latch of the door, and she pushed it open. What she walked into was not what she had expected. She had expected the den of 3 bachelors. Dirty dishes, a sour smell, the mean disorder of men who had forgotten how civilization looked. What she walked into was a home. The floors were clean-swept pine. The stone hearth was swept too, and in it a fire roared behind a screen of woven iron. A long plank table ran the length of the main room, set with 4 places. 4, not 3. 4 wooden plates, 4 tin cups, 4 iron forks, laid as carefully as a mother lays a table for Sunday dinner. Beyond the table, she could see a kitchen with a cast iron stove and rows of shelves neatly filled with tin goods and jars of preserved fruit. Beyond the kitchen, she could see a doorway leading to what must be Holden's room. Along the far wall, floor to ceiling, stood a wooden bookcase filled with books. More books than she had seen outside of a library in Philadelphia. A violin and a long bow hung on pegs above the bookcase. On another peg hung a small frame photograph. A woman, dark hair, a firm, sweet mouth, eyes like the brother's eyes, the mother they had buried when they were 12 years old. Elspeth stood in the middle of the warm, clean room, and she began to cry. She did not cry loudly. She had never been a woman who cried loudly. She cried the way she had been crying for 9 months since the first cough had shaken her father's frame. Quietly, with her shoulders still, with one hand pressed against her mouth. The door opened behind her. She did not hear him cross the room. She only felt the presence of a man behind her, and she knew without turning that it was Ezra. He did not touch her. He stood 2 paces back, and he waited. And when she had breath enough to speak, she said without turning around, "I am sorry. I am sorry. I do not know why I am crying." "You are crying because you are home," Ezra said quietly, "and you did not know you were." He left her then. She heard the door close. She heard him walk back out to the barn. She stood alone in the firelight with her mother's shawl around her shoulders and Holden Beckett's coat still draped over it, and for the first time since the dirt had closed over her father's coffin, she let herself fall apart entirely. When the brothers came in from the barn, stamping snow from their boots and shedding coats on the pegs by the door, she had composed herself. She was standing near the fire with her hands folded before her. Her eyes were dry. She had wiped them with the back of her hand and smoothed her hair, and she had straightened her shoulders the way her mother had taught her to straighten her shoulders before entering a room where men were present. Silas came in last. He locked the door behind him. He set a crossbar she had not noticed into two iron brackets set deep in the log frame. Holden saw her watching him do it. "A habit," Holden said, "nothing more. We have had no trouble up here in a long time." "Why did the stage driver look afraid?" she asked. All three brothers went very still. She watched it happen. She watched the same small tightening pass across three identical faces. "There has been some trouble in the valley," Holden said. "Not on the mountain, just in the valley. Cattle taken, a man missing from the mining camp last month. We are careful, that is all." It was not all. She knew it was not all, but she did not press. Ezra moved to the kitchen and began ladling stew from a black iron pot on the stove. Silas went to the table and pulled out a chair for her. He did it without flourish. He did it the way a man does a thing he has done 1,000 times for a mother or a sister. He simply pulled the chair back and looked at her and waited for her to sit. She sat. Silas pushed the chair in behind her. He did not sit himself until she had taken her first bite of bread from the basket Holden set before her. Then and only then did he lower his great frame into his own chair, and she saw him exhale as if he had been holding his breath for a long time. The stew was elk and wild onion and potato and something that might have been sage. It was the best thing she had eaten in a year. She tried to eat slowly. She tried to remember the manners her mother had taught her about. But her stomach had been empty for more hours than she could count, and before she knew it, she had finished the whole bowl. Ezra refilled it without being asked. "There is more," he said. "There is always more. Eat until you are full. Eat until you are warm." She ate a second bowl more slowly. She watched the brothers as she ate. They sat quietly and they ate, but they did not eat like men accustomed to a silent table. They kept glancing up, glancing at each other, glancing at her. It was as if they had all of them been starving for something that was not food, and they did not yet know how to look at the thing that had arrived at their table. When the meal was over, Holden pushed back his chair. "Miss Whitfield, please," she said, "if we are to share a roof, please call me Elspeth." He hesitated. Then he nodded. "Elspeth, there are things we need to settle tonight. Before you sleep. It will not take long." He rose and went to a cabinet near the hearth and returned with 3 folded papers and an inkwell and a steel nib pen. "The first is the marriage contract," he said. "A circuit preacher comes through Silver Pines on the 3rd Sunday of every month. He will be here day after tomorrow. These papers have been drawn up by a lawyer in Helena. Before you sign anything, I want you to read them. I want you to read them word by word, and I want you to ask any question that forms in your mind." He set the papers before her. He set the pen beside the papers. He did not press her. He did not hover. He walked to the hearth and stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, giving her the privacy of reading them undisturbed. She read. The first paper was a marriage contract. It named Holden Ezekiel Beckett as the intended husband. It named Elspeth Rowena Whitfield as the intended wife. It stated that upon marriage she would become joint owner of the Beckett homestead, 1/3 share to her name in perpetuity, regardless of what came after. It stated that in the event of her widowhood, she would inherit that share without condition. It stated that in the event of her decision to leave the marriage for any reason whatsoever, Holden Beckett would not contest a divorce and would provide $500 in coin for her resettlement. The second paper was a statement of terms. It laid out the arrangement Holden had described on the trail. The upstairs bedroom, the locked door, the division of labor, the 6-month probationary period at the end of which she could choose to stay or choose to go with no shame and no debt. The third paper was the one that broke her. It was a letter. It was signed by all 3 brothers. It had been written, she could see by the handwriting of the different signatures, not by one man alone, but by 3 men together. It was short, She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Miss Whitfield, if you are reading this, you have already come farther than we had any right to ask you to come. We are three men who have been alone too long. We do not know how to ask what we are asking. We do not even know what we are asking for. We only know that our mother would want this house to be a home again, and that our father would want a woman of quality to sit at this table. We are not smooth men. We are not clever men. But we are honest men, and whatever you decide, we will honor it with our whole lives. If you stay, we will spend the rest of our days earning the kindness of your staying. If you go, we will spend the rest of our days grateful that you came at all. Holden, Ezra, Silas. Elspeth folded the letter. She folded it very carefully. She folded it along its creases, and she set it down beside the marriage contract. She picked up the pen. I will sign in the morning, she said, when my hand is steady. Holden turned from the fire. Of course. But I will sign. She looked up at him. I want you to know that tonight. I will sign. Holden Beckett nodded once. He did not smile. The smile was in his eyes where it belonged, and she found she preferred it there. Ezra rose and went to the wood box. Silas went to the door and checked the crossbar a second time. Holden picked up the lamp and said, I will show you to your room. Oh. Her bedroom was up a narrow staircase at the back of the house. It was a good room. It was a better room than she had slept in for a year. A four-post bed stood against the inner wall made up with a down-tick mattress and three heavy wool blankets in a quilt of red and white squares that she could tell had been stitched by a woman's hand long ago. There was a washstand with a basin and a pitcher. There was a small iron stove with a coal scuttle beside it, the stove already lit, already warming the room. There was a rag rug on the plank floor. There was a single window that looked out over the dark mountain, and on the sill of that window someone had placed a small glass vase with a sprig of dried rosemary in it. The door had a lock. It was a heavy iron lock. The key sat in it on the inside. The key is yours, Holden said from the threshold. He did not step into the room. No one else has a copy. Lock it tonight. Lock it every night for as long as you live in this house. I will sleep better knowing you have. She turned to face him. Mr. Beckett. Holden. Holden. She let the name sit in her mouth for a moment. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a long time. The lamp in his hand threw shadows up the wall. Because my mother raised me to treat a woman the way a man treats a woman when God is watching, he said at last. And because a long time ago, a girl named Abigail Sinclair gave me 3 good years before the lung sickness took her, and I swore on her grave that if I ever opened my door to another woman, I would open it the right way or not at all. He inclined his head once. He set the lamp on the table just inside the door. Good night, Elspeth. Good night, Holden. He closed the door. She stood in the center of the warm room. She listened to his boots descend the stairs. She listened to the low murmur of 3 men's voices below, a murmur without words, the sound of brothers talking at the end of the day, the way they had talked at the end of every day of their lives. She heard someone laugh. She thought it might have been Ezra. It was a low, surprised laugh, the laugh of a man who had not expected a laugh that day. She crossed the room and she turned the iron key in the lock. She did not know yet that there was a man named Cornelius Thackeray who had followed her train as far as Chicago, and then turned back only because he had run out of money. She did not know that there was a letter in the saddlebag of a horse in a barn in Denver, a letter in which her dead father was said to have borrowed $4,000 on a date 13 days after he was already in the ground. She did not know that a man named Obadiah Ravencroft sat in a paneled office in Denver at that very moment, running his thumb across the signature of her father that he had forged 6 months before and had aged with tea and candlelight to make look old. She did not know that the reason Silas Beckett checked the crossbar twice was because 2 weeks ago, a stranger had been seen in Silver Pines asking where the Beckett brothers lived and had left town riding east before any man could put a name to his face. She did not know any of it yet. What she knew was this. She was warm. She was fed. There was a lock on her door, and the key was in her hand. Downstairs, there were 3 men who had written her a letter so gentle she had folded it like a thing that might break. Outside her window, the Bitterroot Mountains rose into a sky thick with falling snow, and the snow was falling on a roof that would not leak over walls, that would not shake inside a house that had stood for 20 years and would stand for 20 more. She sat on the edge of the bed with the key still in her hand, and she let herself cry one more time quietly the way she had cried before. But this time she was not crying because the world had ended. This time she was crying because she had begun to suspect, for the first time since her father's coffin had been lowered into the cold Philadelphia earth, that the world had not ended after all. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She would learn in the days to come how to cook on a cast iron stove that required the handling of a stubborn horse. She would learn the names of the 7 milk cows and the 12 working horses and the 43 head of Hereford cattle ranging the lower pasture. She would learn that Ezra played the fiddle at the end of every long day, old Irish airs his mother had taught him before she died, and that Silas listened with his eyes closed and did not once interrupt. She would learn that Holden woke before the sun and read his dead wife's Bible at the kitchen table in the hour before the others stirred, and that he marked passages in pencil in a small, careful hand. She would learn these things slowly, but tonight she knew only the warm room and the locked door and the 3 voices murmuring quietly below. She blew out the lamp. She lay down in her clothes because she was not yet ready to undress in a strange house, and she drew the red and white quilt up to her chin. And in the moment before sleep took her, she thought of the letter in her father's writing desk, the last one he had written before the fever took his speech. My dearest Elspeth, if the worst comes, remember that God makes no mistakes. When you do not know the road, put one foot before the other and trust the road to find you. The Lord has never yet abandoned a brave heart. Outside, the snow fell harder. Inside, a lock held. Inside, a fire burned. Inside, an honest man sat at a kitchen table with his 2 brothers and did not yet know how to speak the thing that had happened to his life. He knew only that a stranger had sat at his mother's table tonight, and that the stranger had eaten his stew and read his letter and turned the key in his lock, and that for the first time in 8 years and 4 months, he did not feel like the last of his line. He would learn the other feeling soon enough. For now he sat with his brothers, and the 3 of them said nothing, and the fire burned down. And upstairs the woman they had all 3 written that letter for slept for the first time in a room with her name on it. And outside on a trail 2 miles below the cabin, a lone rider in a black oilskin coat sat his horse for a long time in the falling snow, looking up at the pinpoint of lamplight in the upstairs window of a cabin he had been paid good money to find. He did not ride closer. Not tonight. He turned his horse east and he rode back down the trail towards Silver Pines. And before he reached the edge of the town, he had already begun composing in his head the telegram he would send in the morning. The telegram would be 3 words long. She is here. The first thing Elspeth Whitfield learned about life on the Beckett homestead was that it began before the sun. She woke to the sound of an axe, a steady, unhurried rhythm coming from somewhere behind the house. Thock, a pause, thock, a pause, thock. The sound of a man who had split so much wood in his life that he no longer needed to think about it, the way a man who has prayed for 40 years no longer needs to search for the words. She sat up in the strange bed, and for a moment she did not know where she was. Then she saw the red and white quilt and the rag rug and the sprig of dried rosemary on the windowsill, and the whole of the day before came back to her in a rush that left her breathless. The stagecoach, the signpost, the 3 men on 3 horses coming down out of the pines, the stew, the letter folded along its creases, the key still in the lock. She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the world had been made new. 3 inches of fresh snow lay across the yard. The split rail fence, the barn roof, the woodshed all softened under a clean white hand. The sun was not yet up, but the eastern sky had begun to pale behind the mountains. And by that dim blue light, she could see Silas Beckett at the chopping block behind the barn, his canvas coat off, despite the cold, his suspenders down around his hips, swinging a double-bit axe in long, easy arcs. A pile of split pine grew at his feet. His breath rose in a white column above his head. She watched him a long moment before she pulled back from the window, embarrassed to be watching it all. She dressed quickly in the cold room. She poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her face. The water was cold enough to hurt her teeth. She coiled her hair and pinned it up the way her mother had taught her. She smoothed the navy traveling dress as best she could, though the dress had seen 11 days of hard travel and showed every hour of it. She unlocked the door and went down the stairs. Holden sat at the kitchen table with a coffee cup at his elbow and an open Bible before him. He wore a clean blue flannel shirt she had not seen yesterday. When he heard her step on the stairs, he looked up and she watched him school his face into something neutral before he spoke, though not before she had seen the first unguarded thing pass across it. Relief, as if he had lain awake wondering whether she would still be in the house when morning came, and now that she was, he did not trust himself to show how much it meant. "Good morning." He stood up when he said it. He stood the way a man stood when a woman entered a room, and she realized with a small shock that no man had stood for her since her father had died. "Good morning. There is coffee, and Ezra has warm biscuits in the oven. He has been up since 4, I think. He does not sleep well." Holden said this without meeting her eyes, as if he had revealed something about his brother that his brother would not have wished to have revealed. "Sit. Please. Eat." She sat. Ezra came in from the kitchen with a plate and set it before her. 2 biscuits, a slab of yellow butter, a jar of what looked to be wild blackberry preserves, a rasher of bacon, a fried egg with a yolk the color of orange fire. "We have 7 hens," Ezra said quietly. "The eggs are better than what you get back east. I do not know why my mother used to say it was the mountain grass the chickens pick through." "Thank you." "You do not have to thank me for breakfast, miss. You live here now." He said it simply without ceremony, and he did not wait for her to reply. He went back to the stove where he was frying more bacon for his brothers, and she saw him pause for a moment with his back to her, and she saw his hand go up to his eyes, and she understood that he was not a man accustomed to saying a thing like that out loud. She bent her head over the plate, and she ate. She ate with the appetite of a woman who had not eaten a proper breakfast in 6 months. When she had finished, she looked up to find both brothers gone. Holden had left a note on the back of a bill of sale written in a hand surprisingly neat. "Elspeth, we are in the barn. Come out when you are ready. No hurry, H." She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her dress. She went to the barn. She found all 3 brothers there working the horses out into the paddock one at a time. Holden held the halter of a great gray stallion with a scarred shoulder. Ezra was rubbing down the roan mare she had ridden up the mountain. Silas had disappeared into the back stalls, and she could hear him talking low and easy to a horse she could not see the way a man talks to a frightened child. "Elspeth?" Holden caught sight of her. "Come meet them. If you are to live on this place, you should know the names of the horses before you know the names of the men. A horse remembers a voice." "The men also remember a voice," Ezra said from the other side of the barn, and Holden's mouth twitched in the nearest thing to a smile she had seen from him. He introduced her to the horses. The gray stallion was Methuselah. The roan mare was June. There were 2 dappled working horses called Samson and Job. There were 4 mares and a new filly named Mercy. The filly came to Elspeth at once when Elspeth held out her hand, and she felt the warm breath of the animal on her palm, and she laughed quietly because she had not known it was possible to laugh again. Silas emerged from the back of the barn with a black gelding she had not seen yesterday. The gelding was enormous, 17 hands if it was one, and broad through the chest like a cathedral door. "This is Grief," Silas said. "He was my army horse. He came back with me from the Powder River." He did not offer the horse's head for her to touch. He seemed to understand that some animals did not welcome strangers, and this was one. But as he passed her leading the gelding toward the paddock, Silas glanced down at her and said, without quite looking her in the eye, "I am sorry about last night. I did not mean to be silent at supper. I do not always know what to say to people. It is nothing against you." "I did not think it was against me. Even so," he kept walking, "I wanted you to know. She watched him lead the great black horse out into the snow. She stood beside Holden and she watched, and after a moment she said quietly, "He was in the war." "He was. Is that why he checks the door twice?" Holden was silent for a long moment. "Part of the reason," he said at Balesso. "Only part." He did not explain the rest, and she did not ask. The days fell into a rhythm. She learned the stove as Ezra had promised she would, the way a rider learns a bad-tempered horse. She learned that you did not feed the firebox with any old stick of pine you had to hand. You fed it with split hardwood in the morning when you wanted heat fast, and then with pine in the afternoon when you only needed to hold the heat through the cooking. She learned that the oven ran hot on the left side and cool on the right, and that biscuits put on the left would burn in 8 minutes, and biscuits put on the right would rise like a Philadelphia baker had made them. She learned that Ezra had labeled the jars in the root cellar in a careful hand in pencil on little paper tags tied with string. Apple butter, strawberry preserves, dilled cucumbers, bread and butter pickles, beef stock, elk stock, tomato sauce. She learned that the flour bin held 40 pounds and the sugar crock held 10 pounds, and that these were filled once in the spring and once in the fall from the mercantile and silver pines. She learned that Holden woke at 4, that Ezra woke at 4:30, that Silas often did not sleep at all on certain nights and could be found in the barn loft at 3 in the morning, oiling his rifle or mending tack by the light of a kerosene lantern. She learned not to ask on the mornings after those nights whether he had slept. She learned that on those mornings he ate less and spoke less and watched the tree line more, and that he did not want to be asked why. She learned the quiet of the cabin after supper, the way Ezra took down the fiddle from its peg above the bookcase and tuned it by ear slowly sometimes for 5 minutes before he played the first real note, the way Holden read his Bible in the armchair by the fire and marked passages in pencil, the way Silas sat on the hearth with his back against the stones and his long legs stretched out, his eyes half closed, listening to the fiddle with an expression she could not read, an expression that was not exactly peace, but was the closest thing to peace she suspected he had. On the third day after she arrived, the circuit preacher came up the mountain. His name was Reverend Josephus Halliday. He was a tall, lean man with the red, wind-burned face of a man who had ridden the mountain circuit for 25 years, and he wore a black coat gone green at the elbows, and he spoke with the easy warmth of a man who had married 100 couples and buried 1,000 people and still believed somehow that God had not grown tired of the project. The ceremony was short. It was held in the main room of the cabin before the hearth. Ezra and Silas stood as witnesses. Elspeth wore her navy traveling dress, which Ezra had brushed clean and pressed with a heated iron without being asked. Holden wore a coat she had not seen before, a black frock coat cut in the Eastern style taken from a cedar chest in his room. It was his father's coat. She would learn that later. Reverend Halliday read the vows from a small leather book. Holden spoke his part steadily. When it was her turn, Elspeth surprised herself by speaking hers steadily too. She had thought she might falter. She did not falter. She said the words and she meant them the way she meant a signature on a bill of sale. A thing done in good faith for good reasons with her full consent. Holden had no ring. She had not expected one. But when the moment came, he reached into the pocket of his father's coat and he drew out a thin gold band. It was old. It had been polished recently. He slid it onto her finger and she saw that it fit, and she understood before he spoke that this had been his mother's ring. It was hers, Holden said quietly so only she could hear. She said once that she wanted it to go to the wife of whichever of us married first. I did not take it for Abigail. I wanted Abigail to have a ring that was only hers. But I took it for you, if you will allow me. She closed her hand around the ring, and she could not speak for a moment. I will allow you, she managed at last. Reverend Halliday pronounced them husband and wife. There was no kiss. Holden did not attempt one. He inclined his head towards her, the same courtly half-bow she had seen from him at the breakfast table on her first morning, and she inclined her head in return, and it was done. Ezra played the fiddle that night until the stars came out. 3 days after the wedding, the first heavy snow came. It came in the late afternoon, a wall of white rolling down out of the northwest, And by full dark, the wind was screaming around the corners of the cabin and the snow was blowing sideways. Silas came in from the barn, covered head to foot in white, his beard gone stiff with ice, and he stamped his boots at the door and said, "We are in for a day or two of this, maybe 3. Cattle, Holden asked, drove the near herd into the lower pasture yesterday. They are under the lee of the ridge. They will do. The upper pasture moved them down this morning. I had a feeling." Holden nodded once. He did not say well done. He did not need to. The nod was the words. The storm lasted 2 days. It was during those 2 days that Elspeth began, without meaning to see the 3 men she had married into as men and not as brothers who looked alike. The storm pinned them in the cabin together, and the cabin was large, but not so large that 4 people could hide from one another, and she saw them as they truly were. She saw that Holden was the one who checked the windows at night, walking a slow circuit of the main room before banking the fire, his hand brushing the stock of the Winchester that hung above the door as he passed it. She saw that he did this without thinking, the way another man might touch a door frame for balance. She saw that when Ezra coughed one morning, Holden went quiet and watched him for the rest of the day with an expression she could not at first name. She recognized it later. It was the expression of a man who had watched a wife die of the lung sickness and had never fully come back from the watching. She saw that Ezra was the one who kept the house alive. He cooked breakfast. He swept the floor. He fed the dogs 2 great gray shepherd mixes named Boaz and Ruth, who slept beside the hearth. He brought her fresh water for the wash basin every morning before she came down, without being asked, without making a performance of it. On the second afternoon of the storm, she found her navy traveling dress, which she had hung to air, mended neatly along the torn hem where it had snagged in the stagecoach step. She had not asked him to mend it. She had not known anyone had noticed. When she thanked him, he only shrugged and said, "A dress should not walk around with a torn hem, that is all." She saw that Silas was the one who watched the door. He watched it at supper. He watched it when he sat on the hearth. He watched it when he read, and she was surprised to find that he read, and that he read well. She saw him on the second evening reading a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius, a book she had last seen on her father's study shelf, and when he noticed her noticing, he colored beneath his beard and said, "Ezra gave it to me. I do not understand all of it, but I understand enough." "My father read that book," she said. "Your father was a preacher." He was. What kind of Presbyterian? He had a small church on 2nd Street in Philadelphia. He had 70 parishioners when he died. He knew every one of their names and every one of their troubles. Silas nodded slowly. That is what a preacher should be. He would have said the same of a soldier. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the book. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." He was. "I am sorry he is dead." She could not answer that. She only nodded. And Silas, who she had thought did not know how to speak to people, let the silence sit between them with a kind of grace she had not expected, and after a minute he simply turned the page of his book and went on reading, and the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like company. On the 3rd day of the storm, late in the afternoon, Elspeth was kneading bread at the kitchen table when Holden came in from the barn with his coat covered in snow and blood on his right hand. She froze with her hands in the dough. "It is not mine," he said at once, seeing her face. "The plow mare." She caught her foreleg on a snag under the snow. "Silas is with her. She will mend. But I need hot water in the long needle from the sewing box in the brown bottle on the top shelf of the pantry." She moved before he had finished speaking. She wiped the flour from her hands and fetched the brown bottle, which was iodine, and she fetched the sewing box, and she put the kettle on for hot water. By the time the water was hot, Holden had already gone back out to the barn, and she pulled on her shawl and pulled on the borrowed coat that Ezra had cut down for her, and she carried the water and the bottle and the needle out through the blowing snow to the barn. Silas was kneeling in the straw beside the mare. The mare was down on her side, breathing hard, her eyes rolling white. There was a long, jagged cut on her foreleg above the fetlock, and Silas had his bare hand pressed against it, and the straw beneath was dark. "I can hold her head," Elspeth said. She did not know where the words came from. "My father had horses. I have seen this done." Silas looked up at her once. He did not argue. She knelt at the mare's head, and she laid her hand on the mare's jaw, and she spoke to the animal the way she had heard her father speak to his own gelding once when the gelding had colicked in the night. Low, steady, a running soft murmur of nonsense and comfort that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the voice making them. The mare's breathing slowed, the white eye rolled less. The mare let out one long, shuddering breath, and she lay still. Holden came into the barn with the thread and the iodine. He knelt beside his brother. He did not look at Elspeth, but she heard him say quietly to Silas, "Look at that. She has a hand with horses." "She has a hand with more than horses," Silas said just as quietly. They stitched the mare's leg. It took 22 stitches. Elspeth kept her hand on the jaw the whole time, and she kept her voice moving, and when it was done and the iodine had gone on, and the leg had been wrapped in clean white linen, she saw that Silas's hand was shaking where it rested on his knee. The hand that had held the mare's wound closed. She saw it, and she did not say a thing about it, because she understood that he would rather she had not seen. But she also understood suddenly and completely that this enormous, watchful, wary man had been carrying something in his hands for a long time, and that pressing it against the bleeding leg of a frightened animal had taken something out of him he had not meant to give. She thought of the vet she had watched once in Philadelphia stitching a dog. She thought of her father kneeling beside a sick ewe on a farm outside the city. She thought that a man who could work that gently on an animal was not a man who had ever truly been made for war. When they walked back to the house together through the snow, Silas spoke without looking at her. "Thank you." "You are welcome." "I mean it. She would have kicked my head off if you had not been there. She has done it before, almost." She was frightened. Yes, so was I. She stopped walking in the snow. He stopped 2, 3 paces ahead of her and turned to look back. "Silas," she said, "it is all right to be frightened." He looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change, but something behind it did, something that had been held very tight for a long time let out one slow breath. "No one has told me that in a great while," he said. He turned back toward the house, and he walked on and she followed, and they did not speak of it again. But that night after supper, when Ezra took down the fiddle and began to play, Silas came down from his accustomed spot on the hearth and sat on the bench beside Elspeth's chair. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply sat down within arm's reach of her and listened to his brother play. And when Ezra finished the slow air he had been playing and began the sadder one that their mother had loved, Elspeth saw that Silas had closed his eyes and that there was wet on his lashes and that he was letting her sit beside him while it happened. She understood then that the hardest man of the three had decided to trust her. She understood also that she would have to be very careful with that trust, because it had cost him more to give it than she could yet measure. On the 8th evening after the storm broke, Ezra taught her to play a note on the fiddle. She had not asked to learn. She had been looking at the instrument on its peg, the way a person looks at a thing she knows she will never touch, and Ezra had followed her gaze and said simply, "Would you like to hold it?" She had not been sure she did, but she nodded. He took the fiddle down. He showed her how to tuck it beneath her chin. He showed her how to hold the bow. He laid his hand over hers only for an instant, only long enough to correct the angle of her wrist, and then he took his hand away. The touch was nothing. It was the touch of a teacher with a student. It lasted half a second, and yet her heart climbed up into her throat and beat there like a caught bird, and she felt heat rise to her face, and she lowered the bow because her hand had begun to tremble. Ezra stepped back at once. "I am sorry," he said. "You did not do anything. I should have asked before I touched your hand, even to correct the bow." "It was nothing." "It was not nothing," Ezra said. He said it gently. He said it the way a man says the truth when he is determined to say the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. "Elspeth, I will not pretend. My brothers and I. We did not write that advertisement only because we needed help with the cooking. She did not speak. I will not press you, Sarah said, Jane. None of us will. You have the key to your door. You have it for the rest of your life, whether you spend that life in this house or not. But I will not stand here and lie to you about what we hope for. That would be a worse discourtesy than the truth. She looked at him. She looked at this quiet second-born brother who had mended her hem without being asked, who had smiled at her in the snow the first evening, who had brought her fresh water every morning for 8 mornings running. I am not ready, she said. I know. I may never be ready. I know that too. Will you wait? He looked at her with those soft amber eyes and he smiled very gently, a smile that did not ask for anything in return. Elspeth, I have waited 21 years for a woman to sit at that table again. I am in no hurry. I will wait as long as waiting takes. If waiting is all I ever do, I will count that a life well spent. He hung the fiddle back on its peg. He went into the kitchen to start the supper. She stood alone in the front room, her face burning, her hands pressed flat against her skirt, and she understood that something had shifted inside her that she had not meant to shift, and that there was no unshifting of it now. That night, for the first time since she had taken the key on the night of her arrival, Elspeth Whitfield Beckett sat on the edge of her bed with the key in her hand, and she did not turn it in the lock straight away. She sat for a long time. The cabin below had gone quiet. She could hear Holden banking the fire. She could hear Ezra washing the last of the dishes in the kitchen basin. She could hear the creak of the boards as Silas climbed up to his loft in the barn, the soft thud of his boots coming off the long exhale of a man lying down. She turned the key, but she turned it slowly. Not the way a woman locks a door against a stranger. The way a woman closes a book she has not finished reading. She laid down in the dark. She drew the red and white quilt to her chin. She thought of the letter she had read on her first night. If you stay, we will spend the rest of our days earning the kindness of your staying. She thought of Holden's quiet relief at the breakfast table on the first morning. She thought of Silas kneeling in the barn straw, with his hand pressed against the bleeding leg of a frightened mare and his own hand shaking afterward. She thought of Ezra saying, I have waited 21 years for a woman to sit at that table again. She had come to this mountain pumping because she had nowhere else to go. She had come because she was hungry and cold and out of money and afraid of the landlord on Market Street. She had come as a last resort, the way a drowning woman reaches for the nearest piece of wood on the water. She fell asleep that night, understanding for the first time that she might have reached for something else entirely. That the piece of wood might in fact have been a door, and that the door might open if she ever decided to open it onto a life she had not known enough to pray for. Outside her window, the snow had stopped falling. The stars had come out over the Bitterroot Mountains. The wind had gone down, and in its essence, a great silence had settled over the homestead, the silence of a world in which nothing was happening except 3 men and 1 woman learning slowly, carefully, night by night, to trust one another. 2 miles down the mountain, in a rented room above the livery stable in Silver Pines, the man in the black oilskin coat sat at a small pine table with a lantern at his elbow, and he wrote a letter in a hand so neat it might have been the hand of a clerk. The letter was addressed to Denver. It began, Mr. Ravencroft, I have watched the Beckett place for 9 nights now. The woman has not left the mountain. She has been married. The circuit preacher signed the register on the 16th. Your man Thackeray will want to move in the first thaw, before the roads firm up, or in the deepest of the winter freeze when no one is riding the passes. I advise the second, yours in service, E. Crow. He folded the letter, he sealed it with wax, he set it aside for the morning post. Then he rose and went to the small window that looked north up toward the dark shoulder of the mountain, where far above a single point of lamplight had finally just now gone out. He stood at the window a long time. He was not a cruel man, E. Crow. He had been many things in his life: a scout, a mule packer, a telegraph line foreman, a tracker for 2 different sheriffs in 2 different territories. He took money to find people who did not wish to be found, and he took money to report on what those people did once he had found them. He had been doing this work for 16 years. He was good at it, he was paid well, but he had been watching the Becketed place for 9 nights running, and he had watched a slim figure in a navy dress carry fresh water from the spring house every morning, and he had watched the biggest of the three brothers stand every single evening at the kitchen window with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the weather, and he had begun to understand something that troubled his professional conscience. These were not the kind of people a man like him usually watched. These were the kind of people a man like him usually protected. He pushed the thought down. He had pushed harder thoughts down in his time. He blew out the lantern. He lay down on the narrow cot in the rented room, and he stared up at the low pine ceiling in the dark. He would send the letter in the morning, and he would keep watching. Because whatever he thought of the Becketts in his private heart, Obadiah Ravencroft paid him $100 in gold for every month he stayed on this job, and E. Crow had a daughter of his own in St. Louis with a slow-wasting disease, and the doctor bills for Nellie Crow did not pay themselves. He slept. And upstairs on the mountain in the room with the sprig of rosemary on the windowsill, Elspeth Whitfield, Beckett slept too for the first time in her life in a house where four people cared whether she woke in the morning and did not know that three of them cared in different ways, and did not yet know that the fourth person watching her was not in the house at all. Not yet. November gave way to December, and the Bitterroot Mountains put on their full winter coat. The snow came in waves now. A foot would fall in a single night. The wind would scour it from the open ground and pile it into drifts taller than a man against the north side of the barn. Then another storm would come and cover the drifts, and the world outside the cabin windows became a place of curves and softness, where nothing had angles anymore, nothing except the black lines of the pines and the dark shoulders of the mountains rising through the white. Elspeth learned the work of winter. She learned to render lard from the hog they had butchered in late October, standing at the great iron kettle in the yard with Ezra on the first clear morning after a storm, the smoke rising straight up into the cold blue air. She learned to make soap from the lard and the wood ash from the stove. She learned to pluck a partridge that Silas brought down from the ridge and to draw it and to hang it in the spring house where the cold would keep it sweet. She learned to tell from the sound of the wind in the stovepipe whether a new storm was coming. She learned that Holden could tell from the smell of the air 3 hours before any storm what the weather would do, and she learned to trust him when he said, "Bring the cattle down," even when the sky was bright. She learned most of all the quiet. The quiet of a mountain cabin in December was not like any quiet she had known. In Philadelphia, there had always been sound: carriages on cobblestones, the bells of St. Peter's across the square, the cries of vendors, her father's congregation on a Sunday morning. Even at night, the city had its sounds. Here there was only the wind, and when the wind was down, there was nothing at all. She had thought she would find that quiet frightening. Instead, she found it held her the way the red and white quilt held her in the dark. On the 4th of December, Ezra came into the kitchen with 3 letters and his face arranged very carefully. The post rider came up, he said. He was half frozen. I gave it to coffee. He is back down the trail now. 3 letters. Holden looked up from the ledger he had been keeping at the table. That is a lot of posts for this house. 2 for you, 1 for Elspeth. Elspeth dried her hands on her apron. A letter for me, from whom? It is a woman's hand, postmarked Philadelphia. Ezra held it out to her, and then he added more gently, there is a mourning border on the envelope. Her hand closed around the letter, and she sat down at the table without meaning to. She looked at the address. She recognized the hand at once. Her cousin Prudence, who had written her exactly twice in her life, once when her father had first taken sick, and once to say she was sorry she could not come to the funeral because of the weather. She opened it, she read it again. She set it down on the table very carefully, face down, and she pressed her hands flat on top of it as if she were afraid the words might lift up from the paper and fly around the room. Elspeth. It was Holden's voice. He had risen from his chair without her noticing, and he stood across the table from her, his hands spread on the wood, leaning forward slightly. Ezra stood in the kitchen doorway. Silas, who had been oiling a bridle near the hearth, had gone still with the oil rag in his hand. My cousin writes that Cornelius Thackeray has been in Philadelphia asking after me, she said. Her voice came out thinner than she had intended. He is telling people that I stole money from my father's estate. He says he is my guardian under the law and that he has been cheated and that I have run off to the territories with his money. He has hired a lawyer. She kept her hands on the letter. There is more, she said. Go on. He has been asking where I went. Someone in the boarding house on Market Street gave him the name of the advertisement. I answered. The Beckett name, Silver Pines, Montana Territory. She drew a breath. My cousin writes that he left Philadelphia on the 22nd of November. He bought a through ticket on the Northern Pacific. She thinks he has been on the rail for 2 weeks already. The silence in the kitchen had a weight to it. He has no claim on you, Holden said. He was married to my sister Cordelia before she died. My father, out of grief and old affection, made him executor of his small estate. That was the only paper Thackeray ever held. He used it to empty the bank account in April and vanish. He has no legal standing as my guardian. I am 22 years old. I am a married woman. He has nothing. Then we have nothing to fear. She looked up at him. Holden, a man who forged his way into $2,400 of my father's savings is not a man who needs a true legal claim. He is a man who needs a story that sounds true for an hour or two. And if he is already on the rail from Philadelphia, he will be in Billings in a week. Silas spoke for the first time. He will not come alone. No, Elspeth said. I do not think he will. Silas set down the bridle and the oil rag. He went to the peg by the door and took down his coat. He did not say where he was going. Holden did not ask. Ezra turned back into the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. The rhythm of the house had changed in the space of 30 seconds, the way the rhythm of a ship changes when the lookout sees weather on the horizon without a word being spoken about it. Silas went out. The door closed. They heard him cross the yard to the barn. What is he doing? Elspeth asked. Checking the back trail, looking at the snow on the cut-off road. He will ride down to Silver Pines tonight to see who has come up on the last stage. Holden sat back down across from her. Elspeth, listen to me. She listened. Your brother-in-law, Thackeray, he can ride into Silver Pines. He can stand in the street and shout your name from morning until night. He can hire a lawyer in Missoula. He can file papers in Helena. He can do all of that and it will not matter. Because to get to you, he has to come up this mountain. And to come up this mountain, he has to come past Silas. Holden paused. And he will not come past Silas. She looked at the man she had married 18 days ago. She looked at his hard, steady eyes and at the quiet assurance in his voice, and she understood that he was not boasting. He was telling her a fact about the world as he knew it. All right, she said. All right. All right, I believe you. He looked at her as if she had said something that surprised him. Then he nodded once and he went back to his ledger, and Ezra brought her a cup of tea, and the afternoon went on, and the cabin held, and the snow kept falling, and the great black mountain above them stood where it had always stood. But that night Elspeth did not sleep. She lay in her bed in the dark, and she watched the window, and she listened, and sometime after midnight she heard Silas ride back in. She heard the barn door open and close. She heard the barn door open and close a second time an hour later, which meant Silas had come back out and was walking the yard. She heard him walk the yard 3 times before dawn. She understood that he had not slept at all. In the morning, he came into the kitchen while she was setting out the biscuits, and he sat down at the table and he looked at her and he said, without preamble, there is a man in Silver Pines who arrived on the Wednesday stage. He is tall. He wears city clothes. He has 2 men with him who are not city men. They are mining camp men, and they drink at the bar of the Silver Spur, and they have been asking about the road up to the Beckett place and how many miles and how steep and whether the trail is clear for horses in this weather. She sat down across from him. They have been asking what they can learn about the 3 brothers who live up there, Silas said. They have been asking whether we are the kind of men who keep our own counsel or whether we ride into town on Saturdays. They have been asking whether we have a woman on the place and whether that woman was brought up in a stagecoach about 2.5 weeks ago. They have been asking this of the barkeep and the liveryman and the postmaster, and all three of those men are friends of ours, and all three of them have told those strangers nothing. He reached across the table and he picked up the coffee pot and he poured himself a cup. Thackeray did not come alone, he said. He brought two hired hands. They are not professionals. They are drunks with guns, but drunks with guns can still kill a man. He paused and his eyes went hard. There is a fourth man in town. A tracker in a black oilskin coat. He keeps his distance. He takes no drink at the Silver Dropper. He asks no questions of the locals. He only watches the trail up our mountain. He has been there 9 days at least. The barkeep says he pays for his room in Gold Eagles. That is a man on wages from somewhere with money. Thackeray did not hire him. Thackeray does not have that kind of money. Somebody else did. Somebody whose name we do not know yet. What do? We wait. We watch. We do not leave this cabin alone for any reason. Not even the spring house. Not even the outhouse. If you need to go out, you tell one of us. If we need to go out, we go in pairs, and we keep the rifles loaded. For how long? Until we see what he is going to do. Ezra came in from the woodshed with an armload of split pine. He dropped it in the kindling box. He had heard most of it. He nodded slowly and said nothing and went back out for more wood. 3 days passed. The 3 days had the strange stretched out quality of days spent waiting for something to happen. The cabin was the same cabin. The meals were the same meals. The fire burned the same way. But Silas was in the barn loft with the window open to the south all day and all night, a blanket around his shoulders, his rifle across his knees, sleeping only in short snatches when Holden came up to relieve him. Holden did not go to the far pastures. He stayed within sight of the cabin. Ezra did not hum when he needed bread. The two dogs, Boaz and Ruth, who usually slept by the hearth, slept instead by the door, their heads on their paws, their eyes open. On the fourth morning, the thing happened. It was not dawn yet. The sky was still the deep blue of an hour before the sun. Elspeth was in the kitchen building up the fire in the stove alone. Holden had gone out to the barn to spell Silas. Ezra was in the root cellar fetching up potatoes for breakfast. The dogs were at the door. The dogs lifted their heads at the same instant. Boaz, the older of the two, made a sound in his throat that was not a bark, but was lower and flatter and meaner. Ruth came to her feet without a sound at all. Elspeth stood up from the stove. She did not move toward the door. She moved toward the window above the kitchen sink, the window that looked out across the yard toward the trail down the mountain, and she stood back from the glass the way Silas had taught her to stand back from a window, and she looked. 3 men were walking up the yard on foot. They had left their horses somewhere down the trail. They walked in the snow, crust, without speaking, abreast the 2 smaller men flanking the tall one in a long black coat with the collar turned up against the cold. A beaver hat, a cane in his right hand that she recognized at once, because she had seen it before, because it had belonged to her father, because Cornelius Thackeray had taken it from her father's study on the day of the funeral and had kept it ever since like a trophy. She watched her brother-in-law walk across her yard with her dead father's cane in his hand. She did not cry out. She went very quietly to the rack beside the door where the household shotgun hung. It was a 10-gauge Coach gun with 2 barrels. She took it down. She broke it open. She saw that it was loaded, as it was always loaded, 2 fat brass shells sitting in the chambers. She closed it. She set it against the wall beside the stove. Then she went to the cellar door and she opened it, and she said as quietly as she could manage, "Ezra." He came up the cellar stairs at a run. He had heard it in her voice. "Thackeray," she said. 3 men, 20 paces from the door, on foot. Holden is in the barn. Silas is in the loft. I know. He went to the window. He looked for 2 seconds. He turned back and he picked up the shotgun that she had set against the wall, and he nodded once at her, and he walked to the front door and he put his hand on the crossbar. He did not lift it. "Stand in the kitchen," he said, "behind the stove. Stay there whatever happens. She stood behind the stove. There came a knock. It was a mannered knock. 3 raps. The knock of a man who wished to give an impression of civility. Miss Whitfield, I know you are in there. The voice came through the door. She had not heard that voice in 8 months. It was exactly as she remembered it. High, dry, too smooth. The voice of a man who had sold her father a bill of goods over the lawyer's desk and had walked out of the study with her father's cane in his hand. Miss Whitfield, Elspeth, I have come a long way to see you. I have brought lawyers. I have brought warrants. This is a legal matter now. Open the door and let us speak as family. Ezra did not move from the door. He did not speak. Miss Whitfield, I have been told you have been imprisoned here by 3 men who answered a disgraceful advertisement. You are not obliged to stay. I am your kin. I am here to take you home. Still Ezra did not move. Open the door. And then behind Cornelius Thackeray, a new voice. A familiar voice. Calm. Close. Not raised at all. Drop the cane, Mr. Thackeray. Thackeray spun. Elspeth could not see him spin, but she heard the scrape of his boots on the icy snow, and she heard the small indrawn breath of a man who has discovered that another man has come up behind him without his hearing. Holden Beckett had walked up from the barn with the Winchester across his arms. Drop the cane. Tell your 2 friends to drop the pistols they have got with their coats. Tell them slowly and tell them with their hands where I can see them. My brother is in the loft with a rifle a great deal longer than this one, and he is not a man who misses. There was a long silence. Who are you, Quest? Thackeray said. I am Holden Beckett. My brother Silas has had you in his sights since you stepped off your horse down the trail. My brother Ezra is on the other side of that door you have been knocking at, and he has a 10 gauge with 2 brass shells in it, and he has not been in a good temper this morning. Elspeth is behind the kitchen stove, which is where a sensible woman stands when a man comes into her yard before sunrise. You have failed already, Mr. Thackeray. The only question that remains is whether you would like to fail alive or fail dead. It does not greatly matter to me. Another silence, a longer one by my own. I have legal documents. You have a piece of paper. I do not doubt it. You may keep the paper. You will not keep the cane. Drop it. In the snow, now. The cane dropped. Elspeth heard it fall. Tell your friends. Put them down, boys. She heard the sound of 2 pistols coming out of 2 coats and being laid in the snow. Now you will do 3 things, Mr. Thackeray. You will turn around. You will walk back down the trail to your horses. You will ride down the mountain to Silver Pines, and at Silver Pines you will get back on the eastbound stage, and you will ride until you reach a town with a telegraph office, and you will send a telegram to your lawyer telling him you have been mistaken and you have no further business in the Montana Territory. Do you understand me? You cannot give me orders on a public road. This is not a public road. This is the approach to my house. I can shoot any man who stands on this approach and does not ride off when asked. I can do it today, and the sheriff in Missoula will write it up as a no bill before supper, because the sheriff in Missoula is a friend of mine, and he does not care for men who bring pistols to another man's door before dawn. Thackeray was silent. One more thing, Holden said. Before you go, I will tell you something, Mr. Thackeray, and you will carry it back down the mountain with you. You stole from a preacher on his deathbed. You stole from the daughter of that preacher. You put that daughter of her father's house. You drove her to a boarding house where the landlord put his hand on her. You did these things and you thought there would be no ending to them because there was no one left to answer. Well, Mr. Thackeray, there is someone left to answer. There is me. There is my brother Ezra. There is my brother Silas. There is every man between here and Silver Pines who has taken bread from this house or coffee from this kitchen. And there is Elspeth herself, who is 22 years old and has learned in the last 3 weeks that she is made of something harder than any man in Philadelphia ever gave her credit for. You have not come to bring her home. You have come to finish the job of taking everything she has. You will not finish it. Do you hear me, Mr. Thackeray? I hear you. Walk down the trail. He walked. Elspeth did not come out from behind the stove until Ezra opened the door and nodded to her. And she walked across the room on legs that did not feel like hers. And she looked out the open door at her brother-in-law and his two hired men walking down the trail in the blue light. Before dawn, their shoulders hunched, their hands empty. The cane lay in the snow where he had dropped it. The two pistols lay beside it. Silas came down from the loft a minute later. He crossed the yard and he picked up the cane and the pistols and he walked up to the cabin and he laid them on the porch beside the door and he looked at Elspeth and he said, "The cane is yours. Do with it what you like." She looked at the cane. It was walnut. Her father had carried it to every hospital visit, every funeral, every Sunday service. He had leaned on it the last time he had stood up from his chair 6 hours before the fever took him. She remembered the shape of her father's hand on the grip of that cane more clearly than she remembered her own hand. She took it from the porch. She held it for a long moment. Then she walked down to the chopping block behind the barn, and she laid it across the block, and she picked up the splitting axe that Silas had left there, and with two clean strokes, she broke her father's cane in half. The halves lay on the snow. She came back to the cabin. She set the two halves of the broken cane on the kitchen table. She sat down at the table and she put her face in her hands, and for 1 minute she wept, and then she lifted her head and wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "I am all right. I am all right now." Ezra brought her coffee. Holden came in with the two pistols and laid them on the table beside the cane halves. "He will not come back," Holden said. "He does not have the stomach for it. He thought he would frighten you into walking out the door with him. He did not expect 3 men with rifles. He will go back east and spin a different tale and find a different mark." "He will not come back in person," Silas said, "but he will send something." They all looked at him. "What do you mean?" "A man like Thackeray does not let go of $2,400, and he does not let go of a grudge. He will find another way. He has that rat-faced look, a man who works in shadows. He will not come up the mountain again with a cane and a bad coat. He will find a man to send, a paper, a writ, a warrant served through a corrupt court in Helena or Denver or some other city where money can still buy a signature." Holden was quiet for a long moment. "Then we had better find that man before he finds us." Elspeth looked up. "What? If Thackeray is going to try again, he will not try from Philadelphia. He will try from somewhere closer. He will have a partner in the West. A partner with money and a long arm. A bank, a land agent, a railroad man. Someone who has already done this sort of work, who has already bought a judge somewhere. Thackeray is not smart enough to do this alone. He never was. That is why he ran in April with your father's money. He took the easy money and he ran because he could not think past it. If he is trying again now, he is not thinking. Someone else is thinking for him." "Who?" Holden shook his head slowly. "I do not know, but I mean to find out." Silas nodded. "I have a man in Helena who owes me a favor, a telegraph clerk. I will ride to Silver Pines tomorrow and wire him. Quietly, I will ask him to look for any recent business in the Helena or Denver courts involving the Whitfield name or the Thackeray name or any paper that mentions a debt against your father's estate." "Good. And I will tell the barkeep at the Silver Spur to send word up the mountain the minute any more strangers arrive in town asking for our place." "Better," Ezra said, "and we triple the watch until we know what is coming." Holden nodded. Elspeth looked at the three of them. She looked at her husband and her two brothers-in-law sitting around her kitchen table with two pistols and a broken cane between them, planning the defense of her life before breakfast. And she understood something that she had not quite understood before. They were not doing this because the law obliged them. They were not doing this because they had married her or signed her papers or accepted her at their table. They were doing this because in the 3 weeks she had been in this house, she had become one of them. Somewhere between the horse with the cut foreleg and the fiddle lesson and the long, quiet evenings by the fire, something had happened that could not be unhappened. She was a Beckett now, not on the papers, on the account books of the heart, and there was not a Beckett alive who would stand by while a Beckett was being robbed. She reached across the table, and she laid her hand just for a second on Holden's hand. He went very still. He did not lift his hand. He did not turn it over to take hers. He simply held perfectly still the way a man holds still when a bird has landed on his arm and he does not wish to frighten it. She took her hand back. "Thank you," she said, to all three of them. "Thank you." 2 weeks later, on a morning when the sun was shining on the snow so bright it hurt her eyes, the telegram came up the mountain. Silas brought it from town. He did not wait to open it. He opened it on the porch and he read it with his glove off, and then he walked into the kitchen with it in his hand, and he laid it on the table in front of Holden, and Holden read it, and Holden passed it to Elspeth, and Elspeth read the 6 lines. The 6 lines said that on the 22nd of November, a promissory note had been filed in the 2nd District Court of Denver. The note stated that on the 28th of March of the current year, the Reverend Alistair Whitfield of Philadelphia had borrowed $4,000 from the Ravencroft Bank of Denver, Colorado, to fund missionary work, and had pledged his estate as collateral and had defaulted, and the Ravencroft Bank was therefore petitioning the 2nd District Court for recovery of the $4,000 from the estate of the deceased, which by marriage now included the Beckett homestead of Silver Pines, Montana Territory. Elspeth read the telegram twice. She looked up. "The 28th of March, she said quietly. "Yes." "My father died on the 15th of March. "Yes." "My father 13 days before he signed that promissory note." The 4 of them sat around the kitchen table and looked at one another for a long moment. Then Holden said very quietly, "That is not a mistake. That is a hanging offense, and we are going to prove it." Outside, the wind was rising off the mountain. Inside, the fire was burning steady, and the telegram lay on the table between them like a thrown glove. They planned the trip to Helena for 3 nights running before they made their final decision. The question was not whether to go. The question was who. Holden wanted to go alone. Silas argued that Holden alone could be ambushed on any of a dozen passes between Silver Pines and Helena. And he was right, because Ravencroft had already paid 1 man to sit watch on their trail, and a bank that had the gold to pay E. Crow for 3 months of surveillance had the gold to pay 3 more men for 1 dark afternoon with rifles. Ezra wanted to stay behind with Elspeth, and Elspeth wanted to come because the dead man whose name had been forged on that promissory note had been her father, and the court would want the daughter of the dead to swear to the date of his death. In the end, they went together, all 4 of them. They left the homestead on the 2nd morning of a 3-day break in the weather, and they took 2 heavy wagons because a man on horseback could be stopped in a narrow pass by a single rifle, but 2 wagons moving in convoy could not. Silas drove the 1st wagon. Holden drove the 2nd. Ezra rode Grief the black gelding alongside the wagons, his own rifle across his thighs, scouting the trail ahead and dropping back every mile to confirm they had not been followed. Elspeth sat beside Holden under a buffalo robe with her father's Bible in a leather case on her lap, and beneath the Bible in a flat tin box, 3 documents that Silas had ridden to Silver Pines to collect from Judge Hargrove's clerk in Helena. By special post, the documents were a certified copy of her father's death certificate, signed by the Philadelphia coroner and notarized by the clerk of the Presbyterian General Assembly. A letter of sworn testimony from Dr. Joshua Prentice, the physician who had attended her father's last week, confirming the date and hour of his passing, and a bound page of the parish register of the 2nd Street Presbyterian Church, recording the burial and the names of the 3 elders who had thrown the first handfuls of earth upon the coffin. They made Helena in 4 days. The weather held for 3 of those days. On the 4th, a hard cold front dropped out of Canada and caught them in open country 20 miles east of Helena, and for 6 hours they drove the wagons through a wind that cut the face like broken glass. When they reached the edge of the city at dusk, Silas's beard was frozen stiff, and Ezra could not feel his left hand, and Holden, who had pulled his collar up over his mouth hours before, had ice in his eyelashes that Elspeth broke free with her thumb, when they stopped the wagons beneath the gaslight of the first street lamp. Helena was a grown city now. It had been a gold camp once. It had paved streets and gas lamps in the territorial capital rising on the hill above the creek. It had lawyers and judges and newspapermen and the telegraph office of the Northern Pacific. It also had, as Holden had known, it would have one honest man worth riding 4 days for. His name was Bartholomew Pemberton. He was 41 years old. He had been born in Philadelphia and had read law at the University of Pennsylvania and had come west in 1867 because he believed with the pure belief of a young man who has read too much Daniel Webster that the territories were a place where the law could still be made clean. He had lost that belief in his second year. He had kept practicing anyway because losing a belief did not mean losing the work. He had an office on 6th Street above a dry goods store, and he had a wife and 3 children in a house at the edge of town, and he had for the past 7 years been quietly compiling a file on the Ravencroft Bank of Denver that filled 2 deep drawers of a cherry wood cabinet behind his desk. Silas had served under Pemberton's younger brother in the Great Sioux War. The younger brother had not come home. Silas had written the letter that Pemberton's mother had read 3 times before she folded it into the family Bible. When Silas climbed the stairs to Pemberton's office that night, with ice still in his beard, Pemberton took one look at him and rose from his chair without speaking and crossed the room and took Silas's hand in both of his own. Silas Beckett. Bartholomew. Whatever it is, sit down. I will send for coffee. They sat down. Holden unfolded the telegram. Pemberton read it. Pemberton read it again. Pemberton rose and went to the cherrywood cabinet and returned with a file 3 inches thick. He laid it on the desk. He opened it. He turned it around so that Holden and Elspeth could see. Ravencroft, Pemberton said, has done this 17 times that I know of. Widows, orphans, old men whose wives died and whose children are scattered. He finds them through telegraph clerks and land agents and unscrupulous executors like your Mr. Thackeray. He forges a note. He files it in the 2nd District of Denver. Judge Trumbull of the 2nd District has been on his payroll for 11 years. Trumbull grants summary judgment before the defendant can travel from wherever the defendant lives. The defendant loses the land or the estate. Ravencroft resells it through a paper company called the Continental Townsite Association, and the cycle begins again. I have been waiting for 7 years for a case I could take to the Territorial Supreme Court, a case where the forgery was so obvious that Trumbull could not hide behind the word mistake, a case where the evidence could not be explained away by a clever brief. He looked across the desk at Elspeth. Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Beckett, forgive me. Your father's death certificate is exactly what I have been waiting for. Elspeth did not trust her voice for a moment. When she found it, she said, Then we fight him. Then we fight him, but I will not lie to you. Ravencroft has friends. He will not take this quietly. He will try to delay. He will try to bribe. If bribery fails, he will try other things. What other things? Pemberton hesitated. Holden said from across the desk, Tell her, Mr. Pemberton. She has earned the plain speech. Pemberton nodded. Twice in the last 7 years, a man who was preparing to testify against the Ravencroft Bank has met with a fatal accident before the court could hear him. Once it was a runaway team on a steep street. Once it was a hotel fire. Both times there were no witnesses. Both times the case died with the witness. That is what I mean by other things. Silas, who had been standing at the window with his arms folded, said without turning around, Then he will need to be watched in Helena. Not only in Denver, he will send a man up here the moment the clerk of the 2nd District informs him that a counterfiling has been entered, which will be by tomorrow noon. Tomorrow noon, Pemberton agreed. I will file the counter first thing in the morning. Miss Whitfield, I will need your signed affidavit tonight. I will need you to swear to the date of your father's death before a notary. There is a man 3 streets over who will come to the hotel at any hour for $1. Tonight then? Tonight. They signed the affidavit that night. They took 3 rooms at the Montana house on Main Street, and they took the rooms at the back of the second floor because the back of the second floor had only one corridor and no outside window, and Silas stayed awake in the corridor all night with his pistol on his knee and his back against the wall. In the morning, Pemberton filed the counter motion in the Territorial Court of Helena and wired the Second District of Denver that the estate of Alistair Whitfield and the joint estate of Elspeth Whitfield Beckett were contesting the promissory note as a forgery and requesting that the Denver matter be transferred up to the federal circuit on grounds of interstate fraud. The federal circuit judge for the Montana Territory was a man named Cornelius Hargrove, 62 years old, white-haired, a former officer of Army legal counsel under Lincoln. Pemberton had practiced before Hargrove 9 times. He had won 6 of those cases, lost 2, and settled 1. He had never once seen Hargrove take a bribe, be offered a bribe, or accept a favor that cost more than a supper in a hotel dining room. Hargrove was the iron against which Ravencroft's forged paper would finally break. The hearing was set for the 4th of February. That gave them 6 weeks to prepare. It also gave Obadiah Ravencroft 6 weeks to stop them. Holden rode back up the mountain alone on the 6th day to check the homestead and to see that E. Crow was still the only man watching the trail. He found Crow's horse gone from the livery in Silver Pines. He did not find Crow. He rode up to the cabin, checked the barn, checked the spring house, checked the smokehouse, and rode back down to Silver Pines and sat for an hour at the bar of the Silver Spur, listening to what men said about who had come and gone in the last week. What he heard made him quiet for the whole ride back up. 3 new men had come in on the westbound stage from Billings. They were not mining camp men. They carried no picks. They carried instead the quiet, watchful bearing of men who had been paid to do a thing and were looking now for the place where the thing would be done. They had taken rooms at the Silver Spur. They had asked no questions. They had sat at a back table and played cards for low stakes for 3 nights running, and they had watched the door every time it opened. Holden rode back to Helena the next morning. He did not stop in Silver Pines. He did not stop for anything. He pushed the black gelding grief which Silas had insisted he take through 2 nights of hard travel, and he reached Helena at 4 in the afternoon of the 2nd day with grief lathered and trembling, and his own face drawn down to the bone. He went straight to Pemberton's office. He climbed the stairs 3 at a time. 3 men, he said, when he had the door shut behind him. At the Silver Spur in Silver Pines, they did not come for timber, they came for us. Or rather, they came to wait until we came back. Pemberton did not ask how he knew. Pemberton understood how Holden knew. Pemberton said, "Then you do not go back until after the hearing." "I cannot leave the homestead empty for 5 weeks. The cattle are cattle. You can hire a Silver Pines man to tend them, a man you trust. I will pay the wage out of my retainer. You will send your brother Silas down to arrange it by telegraph if you must. But you are not going home, Holden. None of you are going home, not until Hargrove has ruled." Silas agreed. Silas had already thought it through on his own before Holden came in. Silas sent the telegram that evening to a rancher named Adam Hollister, whose wife had once nursed Silas through pneumonia in the winter of '76, and Hollister wired back within 2 hours, agreeing to move his own hired hand into the Beckett cabin for a month at $1 a day, and by the next morning the matter was set. For 5 weeks they lived in Helena. Elspeth had never thought to see a city again. She had not missed them. She found to her small surprise that she did not miss them now either. Helena was a finer city than Philadelphia in some ways. It was rougher in others. It had a bookstore she went to twice a week with Ezra, who bought her a volume of Longfellow and a volume of Whittier and a small octavo edition of the poems of George Herbert, because he had noticed her reading her father's worn copy of Herbert by the fire at night. It had a milliner's shop where Holden, without telling her, bought her a proper winter cloak of gray wool lined with red silk. It had a small Presbyterian church where she attended services on Sunday mornings, and where the minister, an old man named Drummond, had heard of her father by name and came out of the vestry after the service to take both her hands and to say only, "He was a good man, I am sorry." The weeks passed in preparation. Pemberton drilled her on the affidavit and on what Ravencroft's lawyers would try to make her say. Pemberton drilled Holden on the marriage contract and on the joint ownership of the homestead, which was a crucial link, because if the homestead was Elspeth's by the contract, then Ravencroft's claim on it depended on the validity of the forged note, and if the forged note fell, then the claim fell with it. Silas spent most of his days at a gun range on the edge of town, not practicing, but sitting quietly in the corner where he could see the door, watching the faces of the men who came and went, building a mental file of every rider in Helena who carried himself like a paid man. On the 15th of January, there was an attempt. A man came up the hotel stairs at 3 in the morning. Silas, who had been sleeping in the corridor again, heard him before he heard Silas. The man put a hand on the knob of Holden and Elspeth's door. Silas was on him in 4 silent strides. There was a brief and ugly moment in the dim corridor, ended almost as soon as it had begun, and when the night clerk came up at the sound, he found Silas sitting on the man's back, with the man's own knife pressed flat against the man's cheek. Not cutting, only showing, and the man talking very fast about who had paid him and what he had been told to do. He had been paid $100. He had been told that a certain room on the 2nd floor back contained a woman who was known to have fine jewelry on the nightstand. The jewelry the man had been assured would not be missed. The woman the man had been assured would not resist. Silas turned the man over to the territorial marshal, who was an honest man and who listened to the story and then listened to it a second time with the hotel clerk present and wrote it all down in a statement the man signed under oath. The marshal told Pemberton the next morning. Pemberton told Judge Hargrove in chambers. Hargrove, without comment, moved the hearing forward 1 week. The hearing was set now for the 28th of January. Ravencroft arrived in Helena on the 25th. He came in a private rail car. He brought 3 lawyers from Denver and 2 from Chicago. He took a suite at the Grandin Hotel on Broadway, and he walked the streets of Helena as if he owned them, because in his heart he believed he did, because he had owned larger things. He was a thin man with a thin mouth and a habit of smiling only on the right side of his face. He was 67 years old. He had arrived in the Colorado Territory in 1859 with $17 and a used mule, and he had built an empire of forged paper and bought judges and dispossessed widows. And he believed, because men who are never told otherwise always come to believe, that no one now living could bring him down. He had not met Bartholomew Pemberton. He had not met Cornelius Hargrove. He had not met Elspeth Whitfield Beckett. The hearing began at 10 in the morning on the 28th of January in the federal courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Montana Territorial Capitol building. The room was packed. Word had gone through Helena that a preacher's daughter was fighting a Denver banker over a forged promissory note, and every lawyer and newspaperman and curious citizen in the city had found a way to squeeze through the doors. Ravencroft's lead counsel, a Chicago man named Dexter Hollingshead, opened with a speech about the sanctity of commerce and the respect owed to the documentary record. He held up the promissory note, a thick parchment aged just enough to look plausible, and he told the court that the Ravencroft Bank had extended $4,000 in good faith to a respected Philadelphia clergyman for the purpose of foreign missionary work, and that the clergyman had signed, and that the clergyman had died, and that the estate was liable, and that any attempt to escape liability by invoking a technicality of dating was a maneuver unworthy of the federal bench. Pemberton rose. Pemberton did not speak for a long moment. He let the courtroom settle. He laid 3 documents on the table before him. He looked up at Judge Hargrove, and Judge Hargrove nodded once. "Your Honor," Pemberton said, "the question before this court is not a technicality of dating. The question before this court is whether a dead man can sign a contract." There was a small silence. The promissory note offered in evidence by the Ravencroft Bank is dated the 28th of March, 1879. I have here before me a certified copy of the death certificate of the Reverend Alistair Whitfield of Philadelphia, signed by the Philadelphia County Coroner, bearing the date of 15th of March, 1879. I have here before me a sworn affidavit from Dr. Joshua Prentice of Philadelphia, attesting that he was in attendance at the deathbed of the Reverend Whitfield and that the Reverend Whitfield expired at 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon of the 15th of March, 1879, in the presence of the witnessing doctor of two elders of the Second Street Presbyterian Church and of the decedent's daughter. I have here before me a bound page of the parish register of the Second Street Presbyterian Church, notarized by the clerk of the Presbyterian General Assembly, recording the burial of the Reverend Whitfield on the 17th of March, 1879, in the Laurel Hill Cemetery in the city of Philadelphia. He let that sit. Your Honor, on the date the promissory note claims to have been signed, the Reverend Alistair Whitfield had been dead for 13 days. He had been buried for 11. Unless the Honorable Counsel for the Ravencroft Bank wishes to argue that the Reverend Whitfield rose from the grave in the Laurel Hill Cemetery and traveled 2,000 miles to Denver, Colorado in order to borrow $4,000 from a bank and then return to the cemetery and lay back down, the only remaining conclusion is that the promissory note is a forgery. The courtroom did not laugh. The courtroom held its breath. Hollingshead tried. He tried for 2 hours. He argued that the death certificate could be false. Pemberton produced the coroner's commission under the seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He argued that Dr. Prentice could be mistaken. Pemberton produced a telegram sent that very morning from the Bishop of the Presbyterian Diocese of Philadelphia, attesting personally to the doctor's presence at the deathbed. He argued that the parish register could have been altered. Pemberton produced a second affidavit from the current minister of the Second Street Presbyterian Church, confirming the integrity of the register back to the founding of the parish in 1793. Hollingshead began to sweat. Then Pemberton called his witness. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Mrs. Elspeth Whitfield Beckett. Elspeth rose. She walked to the witness box. She was wearing the gray wool cloak that Holden had bought her, and beneath it the navy traveling dress that Ezra had mended and pressed, and on her finger the thin gold ring that had been Holden's mother's. She put her hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. She sat. Pemberton asked her 3 questions. Mrs. Beckett, were you present at the deathbed of your father, the Reverend Alistair Whitfield, on the 15th of March, 1879? I was. Did he die in your presence? He did. I was holding his hand. Was your father on any day after the 15th of March, 1879 alive, conscious, or capable of signing a document? He was not. He was in his grave by the 17th. Pemberton turned to Judge Hargrove. Your Honor, the plaintiff rests. Ravencroft's side did not cross-examine. They could not think of what to ask. Judge Hargrove took a 10-minute recess. He came back in 9. He did not bother with the bench. He stood behind his chair and spoke directly to the courtroom. The promissory note offered in evidence by the Ravencroft Bank of Denver, Colorado, is a forgery on its face. It purports to bear the signature of a man who was dead and buried at the time of its purported signing. The court finds the note void, the claim against the estate of the Reverend Alistair Whitfield dismissed with prejudice, and the defendant estate awarded its costs. Further, the court finds probable cause to believe that the Ravencroft Bank, its officers, and its agents have engaged in a pattern of fraudulent filings across multiple jurisdictions, and the court refers the matter to the United States Attorney for the District of Colorado for criminal investigation under the federal mail fraud statutes. Mr. Ravencroft, you are hereby ordered to remain within the jurisdiction of this court pending the receipt of a federal indictment, which in this judge's opinion will be forthcoming within the month. Bail is set at $50,000. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Ravencroft sat very still. He did not rise. His lawyers rose around him. The marshal came up behind him with 2 deputies. They escorted him from the courtroom with his hands not yet in irons, but with the promise of irons before sundown. He did not look at Elspeth as he passed. He looked only at the floor. Cornelius Thackeray had not come to the hearing. He had been arrested in Chicago 3 days earlier on a federal warrant sworn by the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, on the strength of Pemberton's affidavit in a parallel filing in Philadelphia. He would stand trial in the spring. He would serve 15 years in the federal penitentiary at Joliet. He would die there of pneumonia in the winter of 1887, alone without visitors and without the $2,400 he had stolen from a dying preacher, because that money had been seized by federal agents from a bank account in Chicago on the day of his arrest and returned in full with interest to his wife's sister. Elspeth Whitfield Beckett did not learn any of this on the day of the hearing. She learned only that the judge had ruled in her favor. She learned only that the courtroom was on its feet and that Pemberton was shaking her hand and that Holden behind her had laid his hand on her shoulder and was not taking it back. They stood for a long time on the courthouse steps in the pale January sun. Silas said, "We can go home now." "Yes," Holden said, "tomorrow." Tomorrow. They rode up the mountain on the 5th of February. The weather held. The wagons went easy. Adam Hollister's hired man had kept the cabin warm and the cattle fed, and when they came up the last switchback and saw the smoke rising straight from the stone chimney, it was the smoke of a house that had waited for them. Ruth and Boaz came out to meet them in the snow. The filly Mercy whinnied from the paddock. Everything was exactly as they had left it except for one thing. The world around it had changed. The wolves that had been at the door had been driven back. The door would hold now. It would hold for good. They were married again that spring. Not legally. Legally, Elspeth and Holden had been married since the third Sunday of November. But on the 20th of April, when the snow had melted on the south slopes and the first crocuses had pushed up through the pine duff along the creek, Reverend Halliday rode up the mountain again, and this time he performed a ceremony. Holden had asked for a renewal of vows, said fully with all three brothers standing before the hearth, and Elspeth standing before them in a dress of pale blue calico that Ezra had ridden to Missoula to buy. And this time when the preacher said that a man might kiss his bride, Holden kissed her once carefully on the mouth, and the kiss was the closing of a chapter that had begun in the snow on the trail below the mountain the previous November, and the opening of another chapter that would run for the rest of their natural lives. She gave birth to her first child on the 2nd of March, 1881. A daughter. They named her Temperance Fiona Beckett. Temperance for the grace her mother had shown on the courthouse steps, Fiona for the Irish grandmother, who had died when the three brothers were 12 years old. Silas held the baby first because Silas was the one who had ridden for the midwife through a spring blizzard and had sat all night in the barn waiting and would not come inside until Ezra came out and told him it was a girl and he could hold her. His enormous hands shook when they placed her in them. He did not speak. He only looked. And after a long moment, he said to no one in particular, "I did not think I would live to see a baby in this house." And Ezra, who was standing in the doorway, said quietly, "You did see. You lived to see it. Welcome her." Josiah Alistair Beckett came in 1883. A boy with his mother's mouth and his father's steady gaze. Clemency Abigail Beckett came in 1885. Another daughter who grew up to have her Uncle Ezra's ear for music and who would in time study at a conservatory in Boston. Ambrose Beckett came in the autumn of 1895 when Elspeth had thought the time for more children was past a late gift, a boy who grew up small and sharp and watchful, and who was very like his Uncle Silas in ways his Uncle Silas never quite forgave him for and loved him for anyway. The ranch grew, the cattle grew, Silver Pines grew into a town of 200 souls, and then of 400, and Elspeth taught school in a small log building in the edge of her own property for 15 years. And she taught reading and arithmetic to 47 children in those 15 years. And she lived to see 3 of them become school teachers themselves, and 1 become a doctor, and 1 become a territorial senator. Ezra kept his books, and in the year 1889, he donated 112 volumes to what became the Public Library of Silver Pines. Silas served as the first elected sheriff of the Silver Pines district for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he did not fire his pistol once in anger, although he drew it twice and the drawing was enough. Holden ran the ranch. He grew slower with the years. His beard went to gray early and white by 50, and by 60 he walked with a limp from a bad fall-off Methuselah in 1893. But he was still the first man up in the house every morning, and he still read his mother's Bible at the kitchen table in the hour before the others stirred, and he still marked passages in pencil in a small, careful hand. And Elspeth, who came down most mornings before the sun, too, sat across from him with her own coffee, and they did not always speak, and they did not always need to. Obadiah Ravencroft was convicted of 17 counts of federal mail fraud in September of 1880. He was sentenced to 30 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. He died there in 1889 of a stroke at the breakfast table, alone with no family in attendance, and was buried in the prison cemetery under a numbered stone. E. Crow the Tracker, in the black oilskin coat, disappeared from Silver Pines on the morning after the failed hotel attack in Helena. He reappeared 6 months later in St. Louis sober and employed as a clerk in a freight office. His daughter Nellie lived 7 more years. He paid the doctor bills himself. He never again took money to watch a house, and he never again saw the Bitterroots. And when he died in 1894, the sisters at the charity hospital who buried him found in his coat pocket a folded piece of newsprint from a Helena paper dated February the 6th, 1880, bearing a short account of a preacher's daughter who had defeated a Denver banker in the federal court. They did not know why he had kept it. They did not ask. They buried it with him. The years kept turning. Decades turned. On the afternoon of the 15th of September in the year 1920, Elspeth Whitfield Beckett, age 62, stood on the porch of the cabin her husband and his brothers had built before she was born. It was not the same cabin exactly. 3 rooms had been added at the back in 1884. A full second story on the east wing in 1892. The kitchen had been expanded in 1901, and the roof had been re-shingled with proper cedar 3 times since she first stood in the snow and looked up at it. But the great stone chimney was the same stone chimney. The pegs by the door still held coats that belonged to men named Beckett. The photograph on the far wall of the dark-haired woman with the firm, sweet mouth was the same photograph that had hung there the first night she walked in from the snow. She was wearing a gray wool dress. Her hair was mostly white now, pinned up the way her mother had taught her a long time ago in a city a long way east. On her finger still was the thin gold ring that had been Fiona Beckett's ring before it had been Elspeth's. The yard was full of people. Temperance was there, her oldest daughter, a stout, warm-handed woman of 39, who had taken her mother's schoolhouse over when her mother had retired in 1912. Temperance had 3 children of her own and was watching the 4th grandchild of the family toddle across the grass toward a pair of half-grown puppies. Josiah was at the far pasture where he had been since he was 15 running the cattle. Clemency had come home for the month from Boston with her husband and her 2 sons. Ambrose, the late child, the youngest, was standing on the porch beside his mother, his hand resting lightly on her elbow, the way a grown son's hand rests on his aging mother's elbow, when there is no particular reason except the reason of love. Holden sat in the rocking chair at the far end of the porch. He was 74 years old. His beard was white as the snow had been on the first night. His left leg, which had never fully come back from the fall-off Methuselah 27 years ago, was propped on a low stool. A wool blanket covered his knees. He was looking out across the valley toward the mountains, as he had looked out across the valley toward the mountains every afternoon of his adult life when he was not working, and his eyes, which were still the whiskey amber, they had been the first time she saw them, moved from the peaks of the Bitterroots to his wife's face and stayed there. Ezra was under the great ponderosa that he himself had planted as a seedling in 1881, the year Temperance was born. He had a fiddle under his chin. It was not the old fiddle which had been put away in its case years ago. This was a newer one, a Silver Pines luthier's work given to him by Clemency for his 60th birthday. He was playing slowly an old Irish air, one of the first tunes his mother had ever taught him, and the air moved across the yard the way the wind moves across water, and the children stopped their running for a moment to listen. Silas was at the chopping block behind the barn. He was still splitting wood. He did not split much of it anymore. The family did not need him to. They had 2 hired men for the heavy work now, and Josiah at 37 could outsplit any of them. But Silas came out to the chopping block every afternoon when the weather allowed, as he had come out to the chopping block every afternoon of his life since he was 16, and he split 3 or 4 pieces of pine slowly with long, easy strokes, and then he stood leaning on the axe for a while looking at the sky, and then he came back inside. His hair was white. His hands still shook sometimes. His eyes, when they rested on his sister-in-law, who was also his sister, who had been the fourth person at the table for 41 years, were eyes that had finally come home from a war a long time ago and had stayed home. One of Clemency's sons came up to the porch. He was 11. He had the firm, sweet mouth of the grandmother whose photograph hung on the parlor wall, and he did not yet know it and would be told one day when he was old enough to understand. Grandmother. Yes, Thomas. Mama says to ask you a question. She says you used to tell this story. Which story, my dear? The story of when you first came. Elspeth smiled. It was a small smile. It was the smile of a woman who has told a story so many times that she knows now which parts of it the children want to hear. She patted the place beside her on the porch bench. The boy sat down. Ambrose behind her stepped a half-pace back and said quietly, I will let you tell it to him, Mother. She took the boy's hand. I came in a stagecoach, she began. It was the last stage of the season. There was no station, only a sign by the road. The driver left me there in the falling snow. I had 73 cents in my purse and a trunk with my mother's shawl in it and a letter from a man I had never met. I was 22 years old. I was very frightened. And then what happened, grandmother? And then she said 3 men on 3 horses came down out of the pines. What were they like? They were the biggest men I had ever seen. They had beards. They had eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. They were identical in every way, and yet I could tell them apart from the very first minute. One was as steady as a stone wall. One was as gentle as the first spring rain. One was as watchful as a hawk on a fence post. Grandfather Holden was the stone wall. Yes. Great-uncle Ezra was the spring rain. Yes. And great-uncle Silas was the hawk. Yes, my love, he still is. The boy thought about this for a moment. Grandmother, were you afraid of them? At first, yes. Were they kind to you? They were kind to me. They were kind to me the very first hour, though I did not know yet how to recognize kindness because I had not seen much of it for a long time. Your great-grandfather Holden put his coat on my shoulders before we had said 20 words to each other. Your great-uncle Ezra carried my trunk up to the barn. Your great-uncle Silas rode back down the trail to make sure no one was following us because that was his way even then. And then they brought me up the mountain, and they gave me stew, and they gave me a key to a room with a lock, and they said that the key was mine for the rest of my life. And you stayed. I stayed. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. She looked past him at Holden in the rocking chair. Holden was watching her. He had heard her tell this story 100 times. He listened to it every time as if he had never heard it before. Because the mountain chose me, you see, she said, and because the men who lived on it kept their word. The boy nodded slowly. He understood this the way an 11-year-old boy understands a story he has heard all his life, which is to say only partly, but in the way that counts. Grandmother. Yes, my love. Was it a happy ending? She considered this question. It was not an ending at all, Thomas. It has not ended yet. It is still going on. That is what I want you to remember. The letter I answered said a man in Montana needed a wife. The letter did not say that I would find a home. The letter did not say that I would find 3 brothers. The letter did not say that I would teach school for 15 years or bury a great uncle of yours whose name you do not know, or hold your mother in my arms the day she was born. The letter did not say any of that. I stepped off a stagecoach in the snow with 73 cents in my purse, and I did not know what I was stepping into. None of us ever know. We put one foot in front of the other, and we trust the road to find us. That is all any of us can do. The boy leaned his head against her shoulder. Ezra finished the tune under the ponderosa, a last long, sweet note. He lowered the bow. The children who had stopped to listen began to run again. Silas came in from the chopping block. He carried a small armload of fresh, split pine. He laid it in the kindling box beside the porch as he had laid it every afternoon for 41 years. And he sat down on the top step and he did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes met his sister's eyes, and his sister's eyes met her husband's eyes. And her husband's eyes moved back to the mountains, and Ezra came up the porch steps with his fiddle, and the four of them sat together as they had sat together on so many thousands of afternoons, and the sun went down behind the bitterroots. Elspeth Whitfield Beckett thought of a girl in a navy blue traveling dress who had stepped off a stagecoach into silence once in a century that was almost done now. And she thought of how that girl had looked up at three riders coming out of the pines and had not known that the pines were opening for her and that the riders were the answer to a prayer she had not known enough to pray. She thought that was the day my life began. She did not say it out loud. She had said it out loud many times over the years, and every one of the people on this porch knew the phrase by heart. She did not need to say it again. The mountain was the mountain. The cabin was the cabin. The fire would be lit inside by Ambrose in an hour. Supper would be laid on the long plank table with more places than four now. Many more, and in the morning, Holden would rise before the sun as he had risen before the sun, every morning of their lives together, and she would rise with him, and the coffee would be on the stove, and the sun would come up over the bitterroots as it had come up every morning since the world began. She closed her eyes for a moment in the last of the light, and inside her, quiet and sure as a lock turning home, was the understanding which she had carried now for 41 years, that the letter had not lied. The letter had only waited. The letter had waited for her to read it through to the end. And the end she knew now was not an ending. The end was only this. A porch, a husband, two brothers, a yard full of grandchildren, a fiddle laid down on a bench, an axe leaning against a chopping block, a white-haired man watching his wife through amber eyes across 41 years of weather, and a woman 62 years old who had once been 22 and alone in the snow, and who had reached out her hand for a piece of wood on the water and had found instead a door. The door had opened, she had walked through. And on the other side of the door was this, only this, every bit of this, for the rest of her life.